I was told this by a mentor one time that you never want to grow faster than your ability to execute it. Growth has killed far more companies than failure ever has.
Setting the line between realistic, unrealistic is probably very biased to the founder and CEO's risk-taking potential.
That's right.
And their approach to doing stuff.
And so whatever that vision is, think of it as your kind of a shorter term North Star that becomes a gravitational pull for the business.
What is the most essential feeling that you're trying to create with your business?
Focus is going away from the priorities, execution slips. There's never too early a time period in any journey to prioritize prioritization.
Pun intended.
Yeah, full pun intended.
Do you have a recommendation there on how far ahead should I be thinking?
What makes that journey far more difficult than others is really around two major areas. Is where do you want to be by when?
Hey guys, welcome back, Funds and Founders. We have Aaron back on for episode 2. And what I wanted to do today and why I called you back is, I know we talked about sort of that intro call you do with people. Yes. Hey, what's the priority framework? How do you help setting OKRs? And I thought it would be a good exercise to talk through the nitty gritty. What kind of questions are you asking? What kind of questions should founders be thinking about? Sort of one of the goals or takeaways I want anyone listening to get is, let's say you're bootstrapped earlier in the journey, you're still figuring stuff out. Maybe you haven't committed to being a full-time entrepreneur, but you want to get on the right path. What is the 80-20 of how do you go about this, right? On one side, I would say, come work with folks like you, Get the process, Mr. Beast, one of his employee guides leaked on Twitter recently. And one of the sections someone highlighted is, he says in this thing that consultants are cheat codes, right? Like if you work with a consultant, they've been there, done that. So they're the way to fast track something. You can probably figure it out on your own, whether that takes you a month, a year, 2 years, you don't know. So the 80-20 of like, hey, one side, come work with you. You'll help them figure this out. On the other side, what should I be thinking about? What questions, what answers, what frameworks, maybe some tools you recommend, and we'll go through that. But that's sort of what I wanted someone listening to take away from today.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, thanks for having me back. Looking forward to another great discussion. And I think to set that up, it really comes down to some fundamental, let's just call them blocking and tackling things, right? And especially when it comes down to the founder or entrepreneur's journey, what makes that journey far more difficult than others is really around two major areas. Is where do you want to be by when? Kind of getting clear on that, whether it's 6 months out, 12 months out, 18 months out. It's almost kind of like that Google Map scenario we talked about before, right? If you don't have a destination that you can plug into Google Maps, the billions of dollars that Google spent on that application just flat out won't work for you. So knowing where you want to be, by when, what that looks like, why that's important, you can then answer the question, from where I sit today compared to where I want to be, what must be true? What, if I don't achieve, will make me arriving at that destination a virtual impossibility? And from there, you at least give yourself a rough, simple framework to be able to understand what are the top priorities from, maybe the far down below secondary, tertiary priorities on those elements that absolutely have to be true for you getting to where you want to be, a remote reality. So I think that's, just to set the table there, that's just a good, easy to understand kind of mechanism that if you don't have that, everything on the journey is going to be exceptionally more difficult. That can be the very thing that separates operating with a bit of a tailwind versus a constant, headwind.
Makes sense. And so just to frame that, so basically what you're saying is figure out where you want to be, and like, is there a particular time horizon we're talking about here?
Yes.
Or should it be just at 5-10 years, or like, do you have a recommendation there on how far ahead should I be thinking?
Yeah, I think not too far out to where it loses meaning, right?
Okay.
as we sit here today, for your audience listening to this, when we talk about things 5 years out, there's no sense of urgency with that. There's no teeth in it, right? It's like 5 years, a lot can happen in 5 years. And guess what? A lot will happen in 5 years. But next week, it's kind of like maybe too soon. You can't put the right things in place to let them kind of build, to let momentum to kind of be created. So when I'm working with founders and entrepreneurs, one of the most helpful time periods is 12 months, right? Okay. Where do we want to be in 12 months? Is this the end all be all destination? No, but it gives us something to work towards that then allows us some working backwards space, right? So if we understand what the destination looks like 12 months from now, and I like to use the question, if we were wildly successful over the next 12 months, what would that look like? What would 12 months from now, if you told me the business was wildly successful, what would it look like? What would have to happen? And once we start really painting on that canvas and starting to understand what does wild success look like 12 months from now, we can just start walking that backwards. What would have to happen in the next 6 months for you to be on track for that 12-month vision? Let's cut that in half again. What needs to happen in the next 3 months for you to be on track for that 6-month milestone? And then we can start looking at different frameworks and concepts like objective and key results to really be that execution forcing mechanism in these kind of 3-month quarterly blocks that makes prioritization and focus actually something that's a controllable for you that now starts making progress towards those larger milestones.
Nice. And so let's take an example, right? Can you help or maybe give examples or maybe ideas of how should people be thinking about their 12-month goals? And I'm guessing there's also some nuance here of what stage your company's at probably changes what that 12-month goal could look like.
Sure.
And then does the personal life of that founder also come into play? Like, yes. What's your recommendation and what capacity do you think people should be thinking about? And maybe there's other buckets, so let me know if I missed any buckets there. Mm-hmm. But how should I be thinking about this framework? Because ideally, and what I'm trying to just get at for anyone listening is, I could say my company should be making 100 million in 12 months, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what is too unrealistic? What is realistic? How do I make sure I'm not selling myself short, but I'm also not overextending my reach, right? Because my understanding is someone in this stage, all they've seen is social media, success stories, case studies online, and all of these paint the best picture possible.
Yep.
Sort of a long-winded question, but like, how should people be thinking about this goal setting? And what are some techniques, frameworks, or maybe stuff you use to help with that process, even before we drill down and get into the backward working from there?
Yeah, the rule that I like to use is when you're thinking about success, and if your business was wildly successful, I think you want to be aggressive with that vision, but you also want to know where that line is from realistic to unrealistic. There needs to be some stretch in there, right? Because if we're just setting goals that we know are guaranteed to happen,
what's the point?
What's the point? That's the single biggest way on how we get complacent and where our goals start losing meaning, right? And so whatever that vision is, think of it as your kind of a shorter term North Star that becomes a gravitational pull for the business, for all the teams, for all the employees. It's stretchy enough to where we can't maintain status quo. We can't just put the car in cruise control and we're going to end up where we want to be in 12 months. But, and this is where as a founder, entrepreneur, CEO, leader, you have to know where that line is, because the second those goals drift on the other side of the line from realistic to unrealistic, you are going to lose your team. And if you have such this 100 million, if you're trying to go from literally 0 to 100 million in 12 months, think about what that's going to look like 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. And you don't want 30 or 60 days into a 12-month goal to where you're so far off track that just like it being too guaranteed, Now it's so
so
unrealistic
unrealistic.
that the same thing happens. The goal loses its meaning. So there's a couple of different approaches that you can take there as you can work your way into the goal using some of these milestones. Like, some seen a lot of successful organizations, while the 12-month goal is kind of where they've set their North Star, it's almost something that they forget about because that's not where the focus is going to be. If we're looking at the next 30 to 60 to 90 days, where we want to be in 12 months doesn't really matter. We've done the work to really carve it down into bite-sized, digestible chunks to where when you can get the organization focused on what needs to happen now in the next 30, 60, 90 days, that's usually far more impactful than looking at this blinking sign on top of the mountain of where you want to be in 12 months from now. So I would caution all leaders and entrepreneurs, stay away from the extremes. Too easy, too hard, because the same thing is going to happen. The goal loses or the vision loses its meaning. You want to find that middle spot. It's aggressive, it stretches, it's that invisible hand that's pulling the organization forward, but know the risk that when you venture on the other side of being realistic, you're going to get into trouble. So another way to think about this is your confidence level. Okay. You want to have a confidence level of around 50%. When you're setting that target, you want to be able to feel kind of 50-50 whether we're going to achieve it or not. And it shouldn't probably be something that you achieve 100%. You almost want to feel like wild success gets achieved if you just get 70% the way there.
I've heard this before, yeah.
So I think a couple of the takeaways here is stay away from the extremes. Too easy is just the same as too wildly unrealistic. Set a target that you feel kind of at your core and the team around you is like, this is going to be 50-50. It's enough to stretch, but it's not too much to demotivate. So aggressive, yet just shy of being unrealistic.
Got it. And so maybe some tips on actual data to get there, right? So like random example, companies doing $1 million ARR, right? Mm-hmm. They're growing 10% year over year. So what is a good goal? And again, this is all hypothetical, but and maybe there's a better example you have, but I'm just trying to dissect it down to what you're saying and and correct me if I'm wrong in understanding this. Setting the line between realistic, unrealistic is probably very biased to the founder and CEO's risk-taking potential.
That's right.
And their approach to doing stuff and their fundamentals on how they think work should be executed, because their team may think very differently, right? If I think a stretch goal is, hey, let's get to from 1 to 5, and I know we do that, that means my team has to put in a little extra work. Is my team ready to do that or not? So there's all these other variables that come into that 100%. Goal setting. So how do you think about that? Because as a CEO founder, it's my job to make sure my team is also capable of getting there, right? Like, how do you take those variables and factors into account for the goal setting that abstract my risk-taking potential? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I feel like, yeah.
Yeah. I think you want to, it's always a healthy exercise to kind of stress test it, right? Okay. And what I mean by that is when you are looking at what level of risk you want to take, what's your appetite for change and risk and making big swings, kind of know why you're doing it. And a lot of this is going to be understanding your market, your industry, or your sector. And so if you happen to be in a slow growth environment, right? Like the SaaS world is just coming out of a big lull in the industry, right? Where it was kind of, some could argue that the past, 2.5 years in SaaS was kind of recessionary.
Yeah.
So let's say hypothetically, the industry that you're in is projected to grow by 5%. And you're putting a plan in place that's going to call for you to grow at 50%. So if you're looking to grow faster than the market that you're in by a magnitude of 10x, you've got to then stress test that, or what are we going to do differently that's going to allow us to get more than our fair share? What are we going to do to grow by 50% in an environment that's only growing by 5%? What needs to be true? What are we doing that others aren't doing? How are we going to separate ourselves from the industry? And so really stress testing Is your goal just some BS number that's thrown against the wall? Or because of your positioning, your strategy, where you're applying operating leverage, where you're going to accelerate the business, is a special nuanced situation that will, in fact, allow you to grow 10x faster than the market? Or are you behind? Have you been underperforming the market in years past? And if that same market is growing by 5%, again, it's another stress testing mechanism. If you haven't been growing at the rate of the market over the past 2 years, why do you now think what's going to be different that's going to allow you to grow at 10x, faster than the market? And then the opposite can be true, right? If you're in a high growth market, let's put a 1 in front of that number, and your market's now growing at 15%. And you're putting a plan in place and you're feeling good about, hey, we've got a 12-month plan that's going to allow us to grow 10%, right? Well, someone needs to raise their hand and say, we are planning to lose market share. If we're only going to grow 10% in a market that's growing by 15, we are by default saying we're going to be donating some market share here, right? So I think the context matters. What market are you in? What's that market doing? What are you doing within that market? And is that going to allow you to outperform, underperform, or is your plan just to maintain kind of the growth of the market? I think those things really matter and kind of go into the stress testing element of like, how real is your projections to reality?
Makes sense. I think another question along the same lines, how much do personal goals for whoever is founder, CEO, whoever's deciding this, how much should their personal goals, family goals come into the picture here? Because I think that also changes how stretched of a goal I want to set, right? Because do I want to overextend myself? If there are scenarios where I'm going to have to do 50-hour weeks, 60-hour weeks, is that on the table? Is that off the table?
Yep.
A random example, I was talking to my sister recently, and she's been on this weight loss journey. And she was arguing with her coach about workout time. And she's like, non-negotiable, the 5 to 8 I spend with my kids after work.
Yep.
I'm not doing anything that. Doesn't matter, right? So, and there's no other time in the day. So I'm not able to get in 4 workouts a week. And so I felt like when she said it's non-negotiable, I've never thought about anything that way. But how does someone take into, I'm going to lump it and say, personal into this journey? Is it something you account for? Do you change the goal with respect to that? And then however you want to.
Yeah, I think you maybe not change the goal as a result of that, but it absolutely has to be something that's evaluated. And kind of back to that initial question, in 12 months, what does wild success look like? What does the business look like? What does you as the founder, entrepreneur, CEO in the business look like? Because you don't want to grow for the sake of growing, right? I was told this by a mentor one time that you never want to grow faster than your ability to execute it. Growth has killed far more companies than failure ever has, right? Uncontrollable growth is almost the worst thing you can possibly do. So think about, as a founder, entrepreneur, CEO, what is your life going to look like if the business is wildly successful? How do you want the business to grow? Is it scalable? Is it sustainable? Because if it's not, you're going to grow a business to a certain point that it becomes something that you hate running. And when that happens, it's very difficult to come back from. If everybody sees their leader who's miserable running this business, it's not the most inspiring kind of vision you want to give your team, right? And so I think you have to think about, what does building the business look like, and what's my life going to look like running that business? Are those two things aligned, or are they misaligned?
Like, are you going to run the business, or is the business going to run you?
That's right, because there's going to be a cost for anything, right?
Yeah.
And so you need to be very clear on what it's going to take for you as the founder to be able to grow the business. And is that a compromise or a cost that you're willing to assume? And if so, what can you do to mitigate the risks that come with that cost, right? So if the business getting to that wildly successful place 12 months from now is going to require you to work 18-hour days, for you to bring on a bunch of, high-powered executives that can help you get there and dilutes your equity stake in the company? Like, what is the cost to you, the founder, the leader of the business, to actually achieve what you're trying to achieve? It's kind of no different than that stress testing exercise that we just went through. And so, what are you optimizing for is the ultimate question that we all have to ask ourselves. We are growing to do what? To achieve what? It's much more important to understand why you're pursuing what you're pursuing, not just what you're pursuing. Because growing to a certain place just to have a founder that's operating like a zombie doesn't do anything. Uncontrollable growth is just a killer to businesses, because at some point it hits a wall, founder burns out, everything gets unwound, and you give it all back.
Yeah. I think one thing that may be good for folks to understand is, adding on to what you're saying, how do you think about personal growth, balanced life? Like you said, hey, nothing after 6 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you take into account those and then be okay with a slightly lower target, right? Like, let's say instead of doing 15%, we do 12, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the cost of that extra 3 is all this other stuff that I don't want to compromise. But then with respect to your analogy, if the market's growing at 15%, you're going less. What's your, not recommendation, but what's your process on modifying your 12-month goal to keep into account, because there's going to be growth on the personal side. So maybe you're not growing as much as market's growing. How do you think about?
I think it comes down to prioritization, right? I think that's kind of the centerpiece, is like, what is your prioritizations, right? What are, back to your sister's example, right? There was she clearly prioritized where her time was going to be spent from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. That's a non-negotiable. That is something that she would be willing to give up, maybe a little bit on her health journey or fitness journey, because this was just a priority that was not going to be wavered from.
Yeah.
I think it really does kind of come down to that. You have to understand, first and foremost, what is most important for you. So for me, kind of same thing. It's like, I try to protect my, after hour time as much as possible. You getting me to commit to something past 6 p.m.,
it has to be like,
it's got to be big. It's got to be something really opportunistic, because how I've aligned my priorities is, yes, running my business and building my firm is one of my priorities, but it's not my exclusive priority. My others is, being as best a husband as I can to my wife, and same father for my kids. Those are my non-negotiables. And so I am not willing to sacrifice one of those other two things to get ahead in one of those other things. So I'm willing to dial back where need be, or what's called for, to make sure that those priorities, which are unwavering for me, no different than your sister, I am trying to have it all in those 3 areas. I'm dialing it in to be able to make day over day, week over week progress in those areas. Anything that gets in the way of that, I'm pretty relentless in how I attack that. And it's just a flat out saying no.
Makes sense.
That's ultimately how you can gauge focus, is what are the things that you're saying no to outside of your current priority scope. So if we broke this down into logical steps, it's first having to define where are those parameters? Where are those guardrails? How are you going to know what to say yes to and what to say no to? And that's why I think it could take us into a deeper discussion, but that's where I think
makes sense.
There's not a big enough emphasis you can put on prioritization.
So at what point does a founder, CEO, whoever is going through this, think about priorities, right? So I set the goal, I backtrack. Some priorities come out of the goal, right? And we'll talk about how you do OKRs and stuff, right? But then all these other things that we're talking about, the guardrails and non-negotiables, at what point in this process should I start thinking about those and trying to figure out what those are? Is it before, after, during? And it's probably something that you figure out along the way.
Mhm.
But any comments or thoughts on how folks start doing that?
Yeah, I advise it's never too early, right? I mean, let's take a step back. And here's what I've seen over the past 20 years. No matter the size of the business, no matter the type of business, no matter the industry, but when you see at an individual level or an organizational level, whenever you're not meeting expectations, when you're not reaching the potential you know is there, it will always come down to these things. Priority mismanagement. So if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. That then you think about the symptom that comes with priority mismanagement, and that's going to be scattered focus. I kind of call it the roulette table, right? It's the drunk guy going into a casino, putting chips on every single number and square on the roulette table. That's what happens to an individual and an organization's focus when priorities aren't clear. So what's the output of that? It's always going to be poor execution. So everything starts with priority. So whether you're operating out of a garage or you're a Fortune 500 company, prioritization on a relative basis means the same to each one of those things. If you don't have clear priorities, the guardrails in place, you know what needs to get done, what must be true by when, everything else is a no or not yet, you're going to have a difficult time focusing or putting the right dosage or level of focus behind those priorities, and then execution is always going to fall short. You're going to be one of those hundreds, if not thousands of CEOs that are walking around banging your head against the wall saying, if only the teams could execute better. We've got the plan, we just got to execute. The problem usually becomes we're chasing after shiny objects, we get excited about this new product or feature or new build, focus is going away from the priorities, execution slips. So it's a long-winded way of saying there's never too early a time period in any journey to prioritize prioritization.
Pun intended.
Yeah, full pun intended.
No, I think that's good because I think a lot of people, especially founders who are just hell-bent on building a company, you're just like at any cost, right? And so like, I think we're talking about this before we hit record, is the cost doesn't materialize or doesn't hit you until it's too late, and it's such a big cost that you've paid. That's like, was it worth it, right? At what point?
100%.
How do you think it's worth it? How, and maybe you've dealt with people who are facing this, but how should a founder think about, I mean, FOMO is a cliche word to use, but like you said, okay, I've set my priorities, but how do I make sure I'm not FOMOing into decisions of like, oh, there's a big event there, there's something going on here, oh, that opportunity, maybe there's something, but you know, let's go do it. How do you handle, or how do people tackle that? Do you have any recommendations on how do people handle this? I don't know if I framed the question correctly, but no, I think you understand.
I think what you're talking about is all the things. So those are going to be the things that jump up and grab you when you don't have systems in place. You can say your priorities all you want to, right? You can hang them on the wall. You can have vision boards. You can do whatever you want to do. What's your operating system? Do you have a forcing mechanism that you are accountable to making progress on those priorities? And if you don't have a system, you are at the mercy of randomness, that next big event, that happy hour that could be exciting, that whatever it is, randomness will always win. And, you know, your audience may be disappointed from the simplicity of what I'm about to say, but it really does come down to discipline.
Yeah.
Right? Anybody trying to achieve anything you want to achieve comes down to really two important questions. How bad do you want it? And are you willing to do what's required to get it?
100%.
All that really means is, are you disciplined enough to follow through on your commitments, regardless of what things pop up, shiny objects, new opportunities? So many times when those things take you away from making progress on the top priorities, with hindsight, you always come to realize that those were just distractions disguised as easy opportunities.
Yeah.
The opportunities are never easy. There is no such thing as low-hanging fruit, right? And so, yeah, I think it really does come down to being disciplined. Do what you say you're going to do, and always ask yourself, how bad do I really want this goal that I've set out? And am I willing to do what's required? Skipping this, not attending that event, staying focused on the goal is always going to be the determining factor of whether you're going to end up where you want to end up or not.
The random analogy that came to mind is I've probably lost weight 3 different times in my journey. Upwards of 80 pounds from my highest to my lowest, 100 pounds from my highest to my lowest. And I was talking to my wife about this recently, and I was like, I want to do it, but I don't think I want to do it enough right now because I've been through that. I know what it takes to lose weight. I know I wasn't the happiest when I was doing it, but I was losing weight. So trade-offs, right? Mm-hmm. And I keep saying that I need to figure out how to flip that switch in my brain of this is top priority right now, right? And there probably has to be some forcing function there because for the past year or so, it's always been second, right? There's an option to go somewhere, meet someone for dinner, do something. I always take that because of the business potential opportunity there. But the right thing for me to say is hey, no, I have to go to the gym 7 to 8 every day. It doesn't matter, right? Yep. Could be $1 million deal, a $10 deal, 7 to 8 is gym time. It's supposed to be gym time. And I think to what you're saying, I think making that switch and figuring out how can you make that switch, how badly do you want it? Because I know that if I decide I want to lose X amount of, I just want to get healthier in the next year.
Right.
I know I can do it because I have done it. But for whatever reason, I'm not able to flip that switch, right? Maybe that's good. Maybe there's probably a lot of reasons for that. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the things that people don't realize is at the core of it, it's just how bad do you want it? I think Hormozi, on some clip of his I saw, he was a founder came to me and said, I get up, I do the cold plunge, the sauna, the meditation, the gratitude journal, the whatever.
Yeah.
It's 9 p.m. and 9 a.m. and I can't seem to get any work done. He's like, because you spent all your high focus hours, 4 to 9 doing these, just get up at 4 and just do the work.
Right.
Don't do all these fictitious things that avoid doing the work because you probably don't want to do the work.
That's right.
Which is why you're blocking your time. But
yeah, I think it's, I kind of like to use the analogy to a lot of founders and entrepreneurs that I'm working with is are you doing the heavy lifting first? Because look, whether it's a weight loss journey or building a business, there's just going to be some hard things you're going to have to encounter.
Yeah.
The further off in the day or the week that you push out kind of the lifting of the heavy weights, it only gets heavier. The heavier that it then becomes, the less you're going to want to do it. And so you keep pushing it out and pushing out the things that will be required to do to get you to where you want to be. It becomes almost too heavy to even grab the bar, right? It needs to be the first thing you grab onto every single day. What's the hardest thing that you're going to have to do today? Force yourself to do it first. You will be amazed how that impacts the rest of your day. Because then all the light weights that you have to lift just get lighter and lighter and lighter. And so you end the day feeling like Superman versus looking at this huge weight that you have to lift that you should have done at 8 a.m. You pushed it to noon, you pushed it to 5, it gets pushed to Wednesday. I'll do it next week, I'll do it next month. Sometimes you just got to grab the bar and lift the heavy weights, right? And that applies to business.
Rip the Band-Aid and just get
That's
it done.
right. It's just grab it and lift. And the sooner you do it in the day, I think the more momentum you build for yourself in anything throughout kind of the rest of the day. And I'm sure we've talked about this before, but momentum is that fickle animal, right? It's the hardest thing to gain, yet the easiest thing to lose.
Yeah.
And so I know of no better way through brute force, just like Hormozi said, it's maybe quit cold plunging and actually start, doing the hard thing that is going to generate the progress.
Yeah. I think it also comes down to, I feel like a lot of content online nowadays, especially about this area, talks about systems and frameworks and this and that. And you get into the nitty gritty of, okay, do I do this? Do I do that? And the amount of time you spend trying to figure out what system to use, you probably could have done 20% of whatever you were trying to figure out, right?
100%.
I joke about, I've been going to networking events since December of 2022 and a lot of events. Probably March or April of 2023, I was like, I should set up a personal CRM. I still haven't done it.
Yeah.
Because I've tried a bunch of times.
Yeah.
I've always tried to find the best tool to do it. But at the core of it, in that process, I've lost the actual reason for me wanting to do this.
Yeah.
Just keep and maintain and build those relationships. Now that's been affected. I don't have a CRM. I still haven't figured out what the best tool is. And I just have a running note stock where I just make notes. And it's not the best system, but it works. But I need to like get out of that analysis paralysis. And like, I think part of it is just there's so much content available that you get drowned in like, what's the best way for, and like, it's like, maybe you know too much and that's hurting you more.
Of course.
Than like just the naivety of like, let me build this and go do that or whatever. Right. So
yeah. And to all that, I would say maybe, right? Simply because I think you're speaking to this trap that a lot of entrepreneurs fall into is like, what's the best tool? What's the best platform? What's the best? It's like optimize for effectiveness. And for you, if that's your running notes and that's what makes you effective, keep it simple, keep it consistent, keep it repeatable. It doesn't have to be some big name brand tool, right? It doesn't have to be the next big splashy CRM. And I think that's where people can focus more on is, am I optimizing for flash? For the best tool, the coolest new feature, or am I opting for effectiveness?
100%.
And whether that's a Google sheet, whatever it is, if it allows you to be effective
and get the job done
and can help you stay consistent, you're going to be tough to find something else that can repeat that dynamic duo.
Makes sense.
If you can be consistently effective, if it's writing on a wall, like whatever it is, when you can check those two boxes and keep that going, tough to beat.
Yeah. Last analogy about this, but I bought a couple Notion templates that are help you like organize goals, lives, everything. And I bought 2 different templates. And every time they have this long ass onboarding process. And I was just like, who's truly using this? If you're already on the system, you don't need a new system. If you're not on the system, the hurdle to get onto the system, I'm like, set yearly goals, do this, track notes here, do that, press that button here, do this. I'm like, there's so much going on that for someone who's coming from a note stock, like this is too big a jump, right? And then I just never ended up using them. But it's part of that whole, in lieu of trying to find the best way to do it, just never happened. And so, but yeah.
Simple yet effective, right? And look, this also ties back to a comment we made earlier. Why do you believe that they've got it set up that way?
Yeah.
What are their incentives? Their incentives are to sell you more stuff, right? To get you even more engaged, to add on more things, right? And so, yes, they want you to kind of use what you just got, but they also want to show you some potential new paths, right? So it's just know where the incentives are, and you'll always find the behavioral suites that follow those incentives.
Nice. Shifting gears to, let's assume I figured out my priorities. I have my goals. How do you backtrack? How do you go from that and then end up to a place where you have these OKRs set up? And then when we start talking about OKRs, if you want to just briefly tell people what that is, what are some other systems and stuff, and then we'll go through that.
Sure. Yeah, I think what's interesting about this transition is it kind of speaks to exactly what you were just saying. The concept of OKRs, of using objectives and key results, actually dates back to the 80s.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, actually even the 70s, if you look at its earlier version, it was created by kind of the visionary management expert, Andy Grove, who was one of the executives at Intel that kind of took them to prominence, right? So there's nothing new about this. It's tried, it's true, and when you can leverage it effectively, I'm a firm believer, yes, it was created in the 80s, but I'm a firm believer sitting here talking to you in 2024. This is one of the most impactful management systems for goal setting and execution because it cuts through all the noise. So to your question, once we have kind of what that goal is, what does wild success look like 12 months from now, right? We can then use the OKR framework to really be that management operating system that helps drive alignment and focus into kind of a shorter term 3-month bucket. And so when you think about objectives and key results, the objective is what we are trying to achieve within this time period. The key results are the supporting things on how we're going to achieve it. And it's important to match this back up to where we want to be as an organization, because if we achieve these objectives, then it needs to be a meaningful shift forward, right? These need to represent, they're not business as usual. They're not status quo. The OKR system is meant to be that very transparent view for the organization that creates common language around what are going to be the significant accelerations or changes we're making to the business to make that big leap. And so, yeah, I think you can use this to really, really be that protector of the priorities. Now there's no gray area for anywhere in the organization of what the top priorities are for the business right now and what needs to be true for it to happen. Sometimes simplicity, clarity, and effectiveness is really all you need.
Let's use a quick example, right?
Sure.
Let's say I'm at $1 million ARR right now.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go to 3.
Yeah.
Random example, right? How do you break that down? And I'm just trying to get at anyone listening, what is the process, right? So like in this scenario, we're talking about a 3x increase in annual run rate of whatever this company is. Doesn't matter what the company is. How do you break that down to, okay, what is the next 3 months? What are actual goals? What are 6 months? And feel free to like generalize a little bit, but I just want to help anyone visualize, okay, here's where I need to be. Here's how I start thinking about it and backtracking from there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's when we think.
And if there's a better example, feel free to like, I mean, I just randomly use ARR as an example. Yeah.
Let's roll with it. And like, I'll give you an even more recent example, right? Like working with a company and their big revenue target for the upcoming year was to really start seeing organic revenue growth in excess of 30%.
Okay.
Right? So we know what we're trying to achieve, but anytime you're growing a business in double digits, especially in this environment and at 30%, you're not going to be able to just keep, it can't be just status quo, right? So what needs to happen that's going to accelerate the business by 30% or more? That's where you start. What needs to happen in the next 3 months for that to be true, right? And in some cases, it could be launching a new channel, right? It could be really going after or launching a new product, new segment, whatever it is. That becomes your objective, right? If we're going to accelerate the business by 30%, let's say launching a new channel is going to be how we tap into unlocking organic growth.
Got it.
So if that's what we need to achieve to unlock that goal of increasing the business by 30%, how are we going to do it? And so that could be as simple as, how are we going to build the pipeline? What is going to be what is the outreach strategy going to look like? How many new discovery or sales calls do we need to start having on a weekly basis? What are we going to strive to achieve from our conversion rate? So it's
to get to that point.
That's right.
Got it.
That's right. And so then.
So quickly on that part, at this point, are there any bad ideas? And also when you're having this conversation with the founder, are you helping jot these down?
Yes.
Is it their job to come and be like, hey, here's all the options? Because you may not always be an industry expert in sort of what they're building, right? But from a high level framework, how does this happen? Who's coming to the table with what? Is there a bad idea? Is it basically like a brainstorming session and then you figure out what's realistic or not? Or how does this conversation look?
Yeah. I found it to actually be helpful when I'm not the industry expert.
Got it.
I can be the guy in the room asking the dumb questions, which makes them think, right? It makes them connect the dots. It's like there is no kind of standard way of thinking about it. So sometimes having an outside mind is exactly what the business needs to really ask the right questions that challenge the thinking. But ultimately, we're going to get to what are going to be the most meaningful things that have to occur for us to hit the goal.
Got it. Okay.
And so, yeah, I wouldn't call it brainstorming as much as a strategy session, right? Because as you've seen in business, there could be a list of 10 different objective ideas that we have. But if we go and launch to the organization 10 different objectives,
it's going to be,
it's watered down, right?
Yeah.
We want to find the 2 or 3 that if we can mobilize the focus of the organization and execute on these 2 or 3 things in this quarter, it makes such a meaningful jump ahead to get us to where we want to be. So once we land on that.
And is this conversation happening with just the founder, their senior leadership, or maybe like marketing head, like who's involved in this conversation? Yeah.
So I have engagements where it goes both ways. Sometimes it's just me and the founder, the CEO. More times than not, it involves the broader leadership team.
Okay.
Because if that team's not aligned and providing feedback and inputs, it's going to be very difficult to get alignment with the organization, right? So most especially it's with the leadership team where everybody can come together. Sometimes it's heated debates, right? It's like, because look, if there's 10 things that we can do, because that's one of the rules we have to abide by is we can do anything we want. We just can't do everything we want.
Yeah.
So if there's 10 good ideas, let's have that heated debate. Let's get it narrowed down to those 2 or 3 things that if everybody at least doesn't agree with, the majority agrees with. And then we use the Amazon principle. We got to disagree and commit, right?
Yeah. And I think the reason I like that is it really forces people to justify, right? Now,
Exactly.
Maybe justify is the wrong word. I don't know if there's a better word, but it forces people to argue their case.
That's right.
And then it's very clear, and you can tell that some things are going to be clear winners over others
100%.
just based on how much people are willing to sort of fight to keep it there, right?
That's right. And it's kind of like, good, you said it best. Justify why this should be the most important thing. What do you know that we don't know? And then vice versa. And so having that good spirited leadership debate ultimately is what drives alignment. And once a leadership team is aligned on the top 2 or 3 objectives to really harness the focus of the organization behind for the upcoming quarter, that then helps share that with the broader organization with confidence, right? And then with each one of the key results behind those things, now everybody understands what are the most important priorities and what must be true. How are we going to achieve it? And that becomes what everybody tracks, measures, monitors, and each and every single week. That's really where the substance of the conversations happen. Are we on track? Are we ahead of plan? Are we off track? What needs to happen? Why are we off track? What do we now know that we didn't know at the beginning of the quarter? How do we adapt? How do we optimize? What did we learn? What do we need to start doing differently going forward than we were doing before? That's where all the magic kind of starts to happen as teams overcome the challenges and the obstacles to make the key results true that achieves the objective.
While on this journey, so you said we look 3 months out. I have the 12-month goal. So you always do 3-month chunks? As in when I'm starting, I'm only looking at the next 3 months?
Yeah.
Or am I not looking at 6-9 months? Or do I then do the next 3 months once the first 3 months are over?
Yeah, it builds, think of it as building down to the 3-month chunk that we can then, so once we get this clear line of sight of what needs to be true in the next 3 months, think of the OKR system then getting wrapped around that.
Got it. Okay.
And so that becomes the execution engine to make that happen. But the reason we landed on this being what needs to happen in the next 3 months is because with the leadership team, we've generated that alignment on the mission. We're all clear on what wild success looks like 12 months from now. We now know where we need to be 6 months from now to be on track to that goal. So as we look at the first quarter, what needs to happen in the first quarter for us to set up the year and be on track, for our 6-month target, it actually becomes pretty easy when you work backwards, because now there isn't a whole wide variety of what the biggest priority should be in these first 3 months.
Makes sense.
Think of the OKR system as just the thing that makes it real. it gets it off paper and becomes that common language within the organization that you can waterfall down.
Nice. So once I get to the 3-month mark, give me one scenario or tip of like, let's say I met some goals, I didn't meet some goals. How does the next 3 months change based on where I'm at now, right? So we've been 3 months in, we're doing stuff, we decided some stuff went well, some stuff didn't go well. How are you adapting? What are some tips and recommendations on how to digest the last 3 months and make sure the next 3 months are more productive and more on track and more sort of, I don't know if aligned is the word I'm looking for, but just more, I don't know, more realistic.
You want to build off of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I think what I like to tell founders is that when you use the OKR system to its best possible ability, you're going to find out that 2 steps forward, 1 step back is kind of BS, right? When you use OKRs the way that they should be used, you make meaningful leaps quarter after quarter, right? There shouldn't be this big step back. There's going to be challenges, of course. But so let's say we've got our first cycle of OKRs. We run through them. At the end of each cycle, there has to be a grading and reflection period. Grade how you did. Which ones did we hit? Which ones did we miss? Why did we miss them? What did we learn? How do we as an organization
get better,
get more effective at executing in the very next quarter ahead? But with the current objectives that we have, we got a couple options. For those that were met and they only had a purpose for that 1 quarter, we can close them out and just move on and with a new objective. We may have objectives that are going to stay in place for the full year. So we keep the same objective and we just replace the key results. What are the things on how we're going to build on Q1's momentum into Q2 so the key results change? Or it can be some key learnings that we determine and we slightly tweak or adjust the objective to mean something a bit different going into the next quarter. So totally up to the leadership team, but the objective from a definition standpoint doesn't change. This is the signal to the organization of what we want to achieve. The key results that support it tell the organization how we're going to achieve it. So when we get to that reflection and grading period, there is no debate whether we achieved it or not. It's not subjective. It's very objective by the way that we've tracked the key results.
And I think one thing that I'd like to just highlight is be very clear and aligned on the data you use and what metric you're tracking. That means an objective is successful or not. Because I've seen so many times when someone says, oh, hey, go pull that number for me. You didn't tell me how you defined the number. So I pulled it in my best guess of what that means.
That's right.
But you're like, oh no, that's off. I'm getting this number. Like, so, okay, show me your query. Your query and my query very different. I'm looking week over week. You're looking 10 days over. Oh, look, I don't know, very bad example. But like, you understand what I'm saying.
100%.
And I think make sure you're aligned on that from the get-go to prevent any confusion on what success means, what growth means, right? Because I could track conversion rates, but if we're looking at 2 totally different conversion rates, stuff when trickles down because just like gets misaligned.
That's right. That's right. So as a leader or leadership team, you have to understand the usage of this concept or system is meant to serve as the common language for the organization. And so if you know that there could be variations around metrics, that needs to get solved up front. You do not want that conversation that you just mentioned in that hypothetical to be occurring midway through the quarter. And that speaks to with the key results that support the objectives, they must be quantifiable and as detailed as possible. Leave no room for error or interpretation on what this metric means, what it is, how it's tracked. That's just part of the pre-work that gets done to make sure that the key results are fully ready to go. They're able to be tracked. They're able to be measured. They're able to be quantified that determine, are we making progress on the objective or not?
And the reason I like putting that in that perspective is if 2 different leaders define a number very differently, it's really hard to then work towards and do that. Like when I was at Indeed, we're doing on one of the teams I was on, when I asked for this alignment on definition, it took a couple weeks to align amongst just 2 different leaders. No, this is this. No, this is this. And I'm like, that's part of where we spent like a month just aligning on definitions.
Right.
Even before you get the numbers at the OKR. And so just being very aware and transparent with that, I think is very important.
No, it's a valid point, because if the numbers can mean two different things, I always put that ownership on the leadership team.
Yeah.
You've got to be the tiebreaker, make a decision,
and
don't expect the clarity on this metric to happen. You've got to force that clarity.
Makes sense. Does the 12-month goal ever change or modify in this journey?
It could. Yeah. I think that's meant to be kind of the less firm of the goal. Yeah, that almost kind of serves as like that mini North Star that's kind of pulling the organization forward. I would be careful on how much you change it, because if that consistently changes, that's creating a whole lot of chaos downstream. And
then the next time you set it, it won't mean as much.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So I always advise teams, if you got to go spend the money to do a leadership team offsite for 2 days near a lake or whatever it is, it's way better to put in the strategic work, pre-work, versus getting 3 months, 4 months into the year saying, we kind of missed on that 12-month vision. Let's change it to this. You just have to be aware of the type of chaos and havoc that causes downstream within the organization. It makes it very difficult for you to then reprioritize and refocus the organization when they feel like they could keep showing up and next month our whole vision's going to change, right? That is the art and science of leadership. And do what you have to do to get as clear as you possibly can be on that destination, because the approach can change. But when your whole vision changes, if it's not something significantly meaningful, major tectonic shifts in the market or industry, put in the work ahead of time to get as sure as you possibly can that where you're dictating the organization to go over the next 12 months is directionally on point.
Makes sense. Sweet. I like that. I think we covered a lot. I feel like there's a lot of questions I'm just asking, but I think we covered really well how to think about prioritization, how to think about goal setting, how to track back from there. And I think it gives people a good starting point, right? Yeah. I think this is a good segue into what are 3 resource recommendations. And maybe if you want to stick around this OKR goal setting prioritization stuff, that you recommend folks listen to, read. I don't know if you have a guide on your site or whatever, just 3 things to just get people started on this.
Yep.
And then eventually they reach out to you and work with you. But
yeah, I think one of the recommended reads for this is a book called Measure What Matters.
Okay.
This is the book that, while OKRs have been around since the 80s, about 10 years ago or so, this is the book that really, and it was probably way more frequent than that, really put OKRs in the limelight. And it was written by John Doerr, major VC guy, one of the early investors in Google. And Google was what really made this program famous, so to speak. This is what Google used to really help organize themselves. So definitely recommend that book. As a supplemental resource, he runs an organization called What Matters now that's purely dedicated to the art of OKRs. And so if you go to whatmatters.com, there is vast treasure troves of resources there, including real life examples that they use to see how you set OKRs, how you cascade OKRs. So those are other resources. And because I've been using OKRs for so long across 30 to 40 different companies, I would put myself in there as the third option. Feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to walk any of your founders, entrepreneur audience on my thoughts on how they can use OKRs, because I'm just a firm believer that it is the most effective management system that a founder should be using for goal setting and execution.
I love that. And I do this bit. I ask you a last question and you give me one for the next guest. And your question is, what is the most essential feeling that you're trying to create with your business?
Freedom.
Okay. I feel like you've thought about that. Why freedom?
Yeah, I think when, that's kind of the common thread between this entire conversation, right? Yeah. I think whether you're a corporate executive, founder, entrepreneur, when you look at people's end game, like what's the end game? What are you optimizing for? What are you striving for? Most times it's because people just want freedom. They want the freedom and flexibility in their life, right? And so I think if you look at the reason why so many people work 80 hours a week is to garner enough resources to then one day have freedom, even though they're sacrificing all of their freedom in the short term. And so for me, like, look, at a very zoomed out lens, we only get one shot at this thing called life, right?
100%.
So live it the way that best allows you to make an impact, but be careful on how much of your freedom you're sacrificing to do that, because what is your 80-year-old self going to regret the most? And it's, going to be spent doing things to try to garner all these resources, stuck in a
to do what?
Meeting room or conference room, only to realize that, I never had freedom throughout the journey. It was probably the reason why it's top of mind is a great image that I came across that showed this couple going on the bucket list trip of their life through the canals of Venice, and they're just asleep on the boat, right? It's like they lived their life with such little freedom, trying to get the resources to do these things, only to not be able to enjoy it, right? So I think freedom,
I think comes down to what are you working towards, right? Like freedom is good, work towards the freedom, but also understand the one thing I would add to that is, what do you want to do with that freedom? Yeah. Right. I think people say like, why do you want to make money? I want to have unlock XYZ. Okay. What are those things? Let's if you can list those things out. Yeah. I guarantee half of those you could do right now. There's just an artificial barrier of I need this amount of money, time, whatever to be able to do this. And in reality, sometimes it's not that unreachable. Yeah. You can be happier, more free when you realize, okay, this is more tangible. This is not tangible.
100%. Yeah. For me, kind of going back to my 3 non-negotiables is being able to strategically build my craft, being husband, being father. I'm optimizing for that. And so for me, it's about having the freedom to be able to dive into each one of those endeavors when at least as much as I want to.
Nice. What's your question for my next guest?
What is the one thing that you should be doing to unlock growth that you're avoiding?
So I've done 8 podcasts in the last 3 days. Yeah. And I was asked, one of the questions was, what is the one consistent thing your business needs to do right now that you're not doing and why? And then maybe similar, not exactly the same, is why do you feel that you're not free in your current journey? Another one was, what would be the parachute or the ripcord that has to happen for you to quit this entrepreneurship journey and just be like, I'm just going to go do a 9 to 5 because of whatever. So I've had a lot of pretty similar kinds of stuff. But it's just interesting.
Well, and the reason I think that's a consistent theme is everybody knows there's no hack, there's no shortcut. Yeah. It's just doing the work. And one of my favorite quotes, I don't even know who to credit this to, but it says the magic you are looking for is in the work that you're avoiding. Yeah. It's always what sits on the other side of the work that, so many people are looking for a shortcut, looking for a hack, looking for that magical component. It doesn't exist. Yeah. It's doing the thing that you should be doing that you're avoiding is what's going to deliver everything you're looking for.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that. My wife keeps telling me that, once I lose weight, everything will be funner, easier. I'll be more lively. I'll have more energy, right? And I think I know that to be true, but for what I don't know why I'm bringing back to my weight loss journey, but all these things we've talked about, there's so many things I feel like I know what I'm supposed to do, but still for whatever reason, I haven't been able to just take the step over and unlock that part of it. But hopefully at some point I can. But yeah, well, I appreciate the time. Well, let's plug you again, and I'll cut it and plug you in the beginning of the episode as well.
Perfect.
I have this joke that retention is 4 or 5 minutes, and so I plug everyone at the beginning, and then I plug you again at the end. But
I like
where should people reach out? Your website, LinkedIn, we'll link everything. But what do you want to plug?
Yeah, it's kind of the 2 places is going to my website, understanding how I help businesses radically improve their execution effectiveness through the adoption of OKRs. So you can learn a bit more about my methodology on my website, performancemindsetcoaching.co. Then also feel free to reach out and connect on LinkedIn.
Nice.
I'm constantly trying to share things that help a founder and entrepreneur's journey there. And so I'd be happy to connect, exchange messages, but those are the two places I show up the most.
Thank you.